Welcome to my channel on the best of fantasy. Today I'm going to take a look at a couple essays written by the author Stephen Donaldson, best known for his Thomas Covenant series. Donaldson wrote a couple, I feel, brilliant essays on the nature of epic fantasy, and the first one was written in 1986 entitled Epic Fantasy in the Modern World. The second, a follow-up essay, is called Epic Fantasy Necessary Literature, and that appeared in 2015. I will be quoting and summarizing these two essays extensively in the course of this video. But if I accomplish anything in this, my hope is that it is to get people to read these essays if they have not read them before, perhaps to reread them if they have read them before. And if not those things, then I certainly hope that everyone will remember at least one thing that I took from Donaldson's thoughts, and that is that epic fantasy is the literature of reintegration. That is a phrase that he uses in the second of the two essays, and I could not agree more. I'm going to explain what he means by that. But more or less, in a world dominated by the focus on alienation and on meaninglessness, and this is something that we see a lot in what we call realism in that sort of literature, where I guess the idea is that to be serious, literature must portray us as absurd and lonely. And this is, of course, a generalization and probably an exaggeration, but I think you all know what I mean by that. Now, I happen to believe that epic fantasy is also very serious, but in a different way. It, like religion and like myth and ritual, it has the ability to offer us a view of ourselves in communion with our fellow beings. In communion with the world, with the cosmos, in fact. And this is true even today with the increased emphasis on what is nowadays called grimdark fantasy. And certainly there are many different kinds of fantasy that can accomplish many different things. But I love what Donaldson has to say about what epic fantasy can do. And that is to say that reading epic fantasy, going on that journey with the characters, can be an enactment of reintegration. It can create a sense of meaning where we are in communion with the life all around us. Now, I want to mention that the second essay is actually very similar to the first. It is a kind of an update in a way. Specifically, one of the things that the second essay does that I really enjoy is that it includes Stephen Erikson's The Malazan Book of the Fallen as one of the examples of what Donaldson is advocating. And I found myself cheering for both of the essays very much. And I think I have expressed some fairly similar thoughts, both in regard to what fantasy can do in my video I made about the origins and development of the fantasy genre, and also in terms of specifically of Malazan, when I made a video on the affirmative morality of Malazan. So I definitely saw a lot of things that Donaldson was pointing out that I agreed with heartily. Specifically, Malazan offers reintegration by exploring empathy and compassion, engagement with others, the discovery of the self in the other, a sense of the transcendent and the sublime. But let's begin with Donaldson's definition of epic fantasy, and he starts off by defining fantasy specifically, which he says is a form of fiction in which the internal crises or conflicts or processes of the characters are dramatized as if they were external individuals or events. Crudely stated, this means that in fantasy the characters meet themselves or parts of themselves, their own needs, problems, exigencies, as actors on the stage of the story. And so the internal struggle to deal with those needs, problems, exigencies is played out as an external struggle in the action of the story. Now, if this sounds a little bit like allegory, Donaldson is careful to say, no, this is not quite allegory. In fact, it's something a little bit more complex than allegory. It is not a one-for-one correspondence where the personified entity absolutely means the abstract concept that is representing. It is something much more complex than that. And I'll explain here a little bit. In other words, what he's trying to say really is that the world is an expression of the character and the character's inner conflicts. And he uses Thomas Covenant as an example, where Lord Fowl is the external foe, but he is also, on some level, an expression of Thomas Covenant's self-loathing. And he struggles against this self-loathing in the course of the story. And this brings us to one prominent characteristic of fantasy, which is magic and monsters, in fact, the fantastic, which arise from the most primal parts of our minds. They are universal expressions because of what they express. And this is a wonderful quote, another quote here from Donaldson's essays. In fantasy, the outside is an externalization, a metaphor of the internal, and magic is an expression of the inner imaginative energy of the characters, an expression of their charisma, their force of personality, an expression of the part of being human that transcends physiology. In other words, once again, and this is another quote right here, the external world acts out the inner reality of the characters. So again, just to reiterate that this is not allegory that he's talking about, and he uses another example of the vampires in Stephen King's Salem's Lot, which he looks at as representing, and this is another quote here, the sucking away of life to feed a destructive impulse. The character's vulnerability to this kind of abandonment of will and self is part of who they are, part of who we are, and the vampire only acts out that vulnerability for them. Confronting the vampire, each character in the story confronts a part of him or herself. The vampire is transcendent and destructive, and within each of King's characters and within each of his readers, there lives a small piece of transcendent destructiveness. And notice what he does here. That Donaldson is talking about not only the characters within the story, but the readers, us, people. And we experience what the characters experience vicariously. We go on this journey with the characters, and that is a very important facet of this. And this is how epic fantasy can offer that reintegration, that psychological movement from alienation to feeling part of the world around one by grappling with such things in stories, by going on these journeys along with these characters. So, it might appear allegorical the way that Donaldson is framing it, but it's much more complex than that one-for-one correspondence. And he talks about someone who objected to the idea of allegory altogether in applying it to his own work, and that is, of course, J.R.R. Tolkien and his Lord of the Rings, which, again, not allegory, that's not what Donaldson is saying, but he is saying something I think very interesting about what happens to the character in the story, that psychological journey that the character goes on, and the one that we participate in vicariously. So he says, in Lord of the Rings, the importance of Sauron, personified evil, resides in the fact that he is an expression of Frodo. Seduced by power, Frodo spends the novel in the process of becoming Sauron. And that is only possible because part of him was Sauron to begin with. And of course, that's the end of the quote, by extension, part of us is Sauron to begin with. And that is why it is a journey that speaks to us. And you can see why this is important. You see it in the context of the modern world and modern literature, which is dominated, at least in intellectual circles, by what we call realism, which is really a misnomer, I know. And this sort of realism, I think there's a perception that it often emphasizes alienation in what Donaldson refers to as a nightmare world, that there is this futile quest for identity, a strong sense of futility in modern literature. In order to be taken seriously, you have to have this sense of meaninglessness. And he quotes Jean-Paul Sartre, who says that man is a futile passion. And this is, of course, a generalization about literature today as well. But I think it's fair to say that there is a very strong sense of meaninglessness against the void in a lot of art and literature in the 20th century, but even a little bit earlier and up till today. So fantasy doesn't take this mainstream attitude toward the void. It moves away from futility. Fantasy, epic fantasy at least. Again, there's grimdark fantasy, which I think is the branch of fantasy that Donaldson does not talk about this in the essays, particularly because it was a term that had not been coined in 1986 when he wrote the first one. But grimdark is perhaps a branch of fantasy that embraces alienation as a central component of it. I don't think it's fair to say that everything labeled grimdark is nihilistic, however. But this is an argument for another time. But when we're talking about epic fantasy, it does not take the mainstream attitude toward the void. Instead, it moves away from futility. And it embodies, and this is a quote now, it embodies the void in order to confront it directly. It embodies the void, okay? Sauron or Lord Fowl or what have you. It embodies the void in order to confront it directly. The characters, still quoting here, the characters in fantasy novels actually meet their worst fears. They actually face the things that demean them. They actually walk into the dark and they find answers. I love this. I love what Donaldson is saying here. And by finding answers, thus, fantasy, epic fantasy, can help to make us, turn us from a futile passion into what Donaldson calls an effective passion. Epic fantasy can be affirmative in an age when we don't often hear affirmation. So Donaldson goes on to define as well epic. After talking about fantasy, he moves on to the word epic and what it means. And he means epic in the oldest sense. Epics in the oldest sense, like fantasy, contain magic. Also like fantasy, epics, and this is now a quote, the epic deals explicitly with the largest and most important questions of humankind. What is the meaning of life? Why are we here? What is the religious and or moral order of the universe? In effect, epics articulated the best religious and cultural, the best social and psychological self-perceptions of their times. They recorded the way humankind looked at itself. So in other words, epics say something transcendent about what it means to be a human being. And epics most certainly make great use of the supernatural, of the magical. And Donaldson traces an evolution. And this evolution is not exactly good news for our self-perception. And even in epics, Donaldson sees a movement from importance for humans to a diminishment where we become over time less and less important. And Beowulf is the first example he gives. He talks about Beowulf as himself a magical, transcendent figure. Someone who could stride through the world and find his own strength within him. And then you move on a few centuries to Spenser's The Faerie Queene, where the humans are no longer the magical ones. We are mere actors in a supernatural world. The magic is in the world that we are wandering through. And even later in Milton's Paradise Lost, a further diminishment where humans are just what's at stake between these archetypal forces of good and evil, God and Satan. So, and this is a struggle that frankly could have happened without boring Adam and Eve. So, yeah, we've been diminished. So we see this shrinking perception of what it means to be human until we reach Tennyson's Idylls of the King, which Donaldson characterizes this way. Epic ideas can no longer function in Tennyson's Idylls of the King, no longer be taken seriously. Idylls of the King is the story of the failure to achieve epic status, epic meaning. And the work's central assertion is, we don't have that in us anymore. And that's the end of that quote. So, fantasy then, epics fantasy in particular, is a response to this feeling that we no longer can write epics. It's an affirmation. It's a defiance. It is an affirmation that we can be effective. And Donaldson traces this to one individual, Tolkien. I do, however, think that Tolkien had predecessors that he relied on and learned from and was influenced by. And one very important example being William Morris, whose prose romances in the 1890s were all about the reintegration of the self, finding meaning in communion with the world and the fostering of connections in mutually supporting and symbiotic communities. So that's what William Morris was all about. It was really all about reintegration of this alienated self into a society, into a community. So I do believe that Tolkien learned from others, but I also think that Tolkien made this more popular than anyone else. There is no argument about that whatsoever. And what Donaldson has to say is really quite wonderful about what Tolkien did, that he restored the epic to English literature. Roughly a century after, this is a quote, roughly a century after the epic became an impossible literary form, he made it possible to write epics again. So that's J.R.R. Tolkien. And the question then arises, and Donaldson addresses it, how? How does Tolkien do this in a world full of alienation and absurdism, where serious literature stays as far from affirmation as possible, and because affirmation is seen as naive or too simple, right? So how does Tolkien do this? Well, Donaldson says he did it by, this is a quote, divorcing his work entirely from the real world, by insisting that there is no connection between the metaphors of fantasy and the facts of the modern reality, by rejecting allegory. So this is not our world, this is Middle-earth, right? This is some other place. Back to the quote here. It is indeed possible for us to dream about heroism and transcendental love, about grandeur of identity in all its manifestations, but only if we distinguish absolutely between the epic vision, Middle-earth, and who we actually are as human beings here. Tolkien, I'm still quoting here, I'm inserting my own words here and there, but this is a quote. Tolkien restored our right to dream epic dreams, but only if we understand clearly that those dreams have no connection to the reality of who we are and what we do. This accounts, I think, this is Donaldson, this accounts, I think, for the strange blend of beauty and sorrow in Lord of the Rings. So, I do think that Tolkien has opened a door for us in a way. We do owe him a lot. And as I said, I don't think he was the originator of all this, but he put it out there in the grandest way possible. And even, I would say, made it respectable again to dream about affirmation and integration. So, and he himself, Donaldson himself, acknowledges that what he's doing in some way is walking through that door that Tolkien opened, the door to writing epics again. Thomas Covenant is an unbeliever. That is significant. Donaldson calls him the unbeliever, right? He is someone who rejects fantasy, but is forced to confront an epic vision. He is, in a way, this is what Donaldson is doing is the opposite. This is what Donaldson says. He's doing the opposite of what Tennyson did. Tennyson had one epic character, King Arthur, surrounded by a bunch of real, failed people. Covenant is a real, failed person in a world surrounded by that which we dream, right? He is, and this is, I'm going to quote again here, he is forced, and here's the quote, forced away from cynicism and bitterness and hatred, toward love, friendship, and loyalty, toward the willingness to risk himself for things larger than he is. If it is the responsibility of every human being to create the meaning in his, her life, then it is Covenant's capacity to respond to fantasy which leads him to create a meaning which is redemptive, rather than ruinous. I love that. I really love that part. Let me read that again. It is Covenant's capacity to respond to fantasy, which leads him to create a meaning which is redemptive rather than ruinous. So we, the readers, experience, once again, his internal struggle, his answer to the void, right? And so thus, while the adventure happens in a fictional world, the real journey is in here. The real journey is inward. So within our minds are entire realms of the strange and the dangerous and the beautiful. And I'm going to quote again from Donaldson. This is a quote: "Fantasy is the literature of the irrational, the transcendent, the spiritual. It is the literature that dares to confront those facets of being human that seem at odds, sometimes wildly at odds, with our mundane waking lives, and it's vital." And I could not agree more with what Donaldson is saying. Now, the Malazan Book of the Fallen, which Donaldson upholds as an example of all this as well, and I myself have described as affirmative, is really a perfect example of the engagement that Donaldson is advocating for in epic fantasy. I could not agree more with what he says about Erikson, and so let me just quote what he says about what Erikson does in the Malazan Book of the Fallen. He tests, this is a quote, he tests our notions of what it means to be human. He, Erikson, challenges us to re-examine how we think about ourselves, our world, and each other, to re-examine the stories we tell ourselves, the means by which we create our own realities. He encourages us to expand our minds and our hearts to meet those challenges, and he does so in lucid prose as seamless as oil. And that is truly wonderful praise, and I think deserved. And so we return to fantasy as the literature of reintegration, specifically epic fantasy, the literature of reintegration. I love this phrase, and I will be using it for the rest of my life. Epic fantasy is a place where we can feel whole and connected to our fellow beings and the life around us. And this, I think, Donaldson is correct, is the attraction to this marvelous genre. It performs functions that are similar to what myth used to do, and I would argue religion and ritual. Like myth, fantasy is also closely related to dreaming, which, and again, I'm going to quote again from Donaldson because he says it so beautifully here. Dreaming arises, this is a quote, arises from the most primitive structures of the human brain. Magics and monsters, as metaphors, are the most universal of experiences. One person may be divided from another by language, culture, race, geography, and history. But if they could talk to each other honestly about their dreams, they would find that they share the same tropes, the same fears and powers, the same irrational exhilarations and dreads, the same dissociated loves and woes. And that's the end of the quote. In this way, fantasy does indeed take on a function of myth and religion. And one more quote from Donaldson here. It is the ability to dramatize, to demonstrate reintegration. And so I've just given really a taste of what Donaldson is advocating for, what he is saying about epic fantasy. And once again, I will put a link in the description below to the essays that I found on the internet, and so that you can go easily find them if you wish. They are very easily available, even if you just Google Stephen Donaldson essay on fantasy. You'd find it that way as well. But I will put the links in the description to share that with you, and I would love to hear your thoughts on what Donaldson has to say in the comments below. So thank you very much for listening to this, and until next time.